The bidding war for her life felt more like an afterthought. The air inside the Entrelian Trade Hub's auction hall was thick, clogged with the sickly sweet stench of unwashed bodies, burnt circuitry, and stale alcohol. The heat from the overhead lights pressed down like a suffocating weight, amplifying the low hum of murmured negotiations and the occasional bark of a drunken bidder. Ryla stood in the center of the stage, her bare feet against cold metal, her arms wrapped around her thin frame. The chains on her wrists were too tight, the edges digging into her cerulean skin, but she had learned long ago that complaining only made things worse. She wasn't the only one on display, but she was the least interesting. The Zoreni were a rarity in the slave trade, not because they were particularly valuable, but because they weren't considered worth capturing in the first place. Too small, too fragile, too quiet. Their homeworld had been lost generations ago, scattered survivors clinging to the edges of civilization, barely noticed by the galaxy at large. She was just another lost remnant of a forgotten people. And she was being sold for nothing. 100 credits, a guttural voice called from the crowd. The slaver standing beside her barely reacted, too busy scrolling through his datapad to pretend there was real interest. 150, 200. The voices blended together, bored, indifferent. Ryla swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. She told herself it didn't matter who won, the outcome was the same. Except it wasn't. A low growl came from the left side of the room. 300. I'll take her. She risked a glance. The bidder was a towering reptilian, a Garvek, his mottled yellow skin stretched taut over thick muscle. His claws clicked impatiently against the metal railing in front of him. Garvek weren't slavers, they were hunters, and the way he was looking at her, evaluating, calculating, made something cold settle in her stomach. The auctioneer perked up slightly, sensing at least a bit of tension in the otherwise dull affair. 350. Another voice, this one belonging to a thin, rodent-like merchant, his beady eyes glinting with interest. She's small, but the Zoreni have soft pelts. Good for specialty buyers. 400, the Garvek snapped. His tone brooked no argument. Ryla's breath came faster. 500, the merchant countered, though he sounded less certain. 6. A pause. The auctioneer's lips curled slightly. 600 go at once. 1,000. The voice cut through the air like a blade. Silence fell across the room. Even Ryla turned her head slightly, the first spark of confusion breaking through the haze of fear. The man who had spoken stood at the back of the hall, arms crossed, weight shifted slightly to one side as if he couldn't be bothered to stand up straight. He was human. Humans weren't uncommon in places like this, but this one was different. His presence carried weight. He wasn't dressed like a noble or some soft-skinned bureaucrat playing at being dangerous. His gear was worn but well kept. Mercenary-grade plating over dark fabric, a sidearm holstered at his hip. He had the kind of build that spoke of strength, but not the overbearing, brutish sort that relied on intimidation alone. His black hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and his face bore faint scars, memories of past fights, past battles. His gaze was unreadable, but there was a sharpness there, something calculating. Ryla didn't know why, but the moment he spoke, the room shifted. The Garvek turned slowly, his slitted eyes narrowing. 1,000? You're overpaying. The human, Derek, she heard someone mutter, shrugged. Maybe. She's not worth that much. Don't care. The Garvek let out a slow, rumbling snarl, but he didn't bid again. Neither did the merchant. The auctioneer, sensing an opportunity to end this quickly, slammed his gavel down. Sold! And just like that, Ryla's life changed hands. The transaction was finalized in seconds. Derek stepped forward, pressing a credit chit into the slaver's greasy palm without a word, then turned toward Ryla. She tensed instinctively. He didn't reach for her, didn't grab her wrist or shove her forward like she expected. Instead, he simply jerked his chin toward the exit. Come on. She hesitated. His gaze flicked back to her, unreadable. "Unless you'd rather stay here." She moved before she could think better of it. The walk through the auction house was a blur. The corridors were tight, the walls lined with dim red lighting that flickered from poor maintenance. The scent of burnt ozone and rust clung to the air, mixing with the distant sound of more auctions, more voices selling lives away. She was used to it, but this time was different, because this time she wasn't sure where she was going. Derek led her through a side entrance into the docking bay. The ship waiting for them wasn't the sleek, polished kind that belonged to traders or aristocrats. It was a gunship, battle-worn but sturdy, its hull dark and marked with old impact scars. Iron Rave, she had no idea what that name meant, but it was painted across the side in bold, slightly faded lettering. Derek stopped at the bottom of the ramp and turned toward her. "You hungry?" Ryla blinked. Of all the things he could have said, of all the questions he could have asked, that was what came out of his mouth? She stared at him, half expecting some kind of trap, some cruel joke. He just raised an eyebrow, waiting. "What do you want?" she finally managed. Her voice was hoarse, unused to speaking freely. Derek studied her for a long moment. Then, with the kind of honesty that made her stomach twist, he said, "I don't know yet." That scared her more than anything else, because monsters had predictable wants. He wasn't a monster, and that meant she had no idea what came next. He turned and strode up the ramp without another word. Ryla stood there, torn between the only two choices she had left. Stay here in the filth and heat of the Entrellan trade hub, waiting for someone worse to find her, or follow him into the unknown. Her feet moved before her mind made the decision. And for the first time in her life, she didn't know if she was walking toward freedom or another kind of cage. The ship's interior was dimly lit, bathed in the soft glow of overhead panels that flickered occasionally, as if deciding whether to keep working. The air smelled of metal, old leather, and something vaguely smoky. Engine grease, maybe. It was warmer than the auction house, but not by much. Still, to Ryla, it felt different. The cold of that stage had been suffocating. This cold was just normal. She stood at the entrance, hesitant, feeling the subtle shift beneath her feet as the Iron Raven powered up. The hum of the ship's core thrummed through the floor, steady and strong, like the heartbeat of a sleeping beast. Derek walked ahead without looking back, moving with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. No hesitation, no second-guessing. He tossed a small duffel onto a worn-out chair near the main console, then started flipping switches. The dashboard lit up, casting sharp blue and orange hues across his face. "Close the hatch," he said. Ryla's fingers twitched, but she didn't move. Derek sighed and stood, walking past her to slap a control panel on the wall. The ramp hissed shut, sealing them inside. The shift in pressure made her ears pop. And that was it. She was officially off that station. Not free, not yet, but gone. Derek settled back into the pilot's seat, running through pre-flight checks with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested he barely had to think about it. He didn't look at her. He didn't tell her to sit. He just worked, as if she wasn't even there. Ryla wasn't sure if that was better or worse. She hovered near the edge of the room, scanning her surroundings. The cockpit was utilitarian, functional but not sleek. This wasn't the kind of ship that belonged to traders or diplomats. It was built for endurance, for surviving things most ships wouldn't. He'd seen vessels like this before. And the people who piloted them. Mercenaries, bounty hunters, killers. Her fingers curled into the fabric of the oversized tunic she had been given back at the auction house. Her pulse was still racing, but she forced herself to steady her breathing. No sudden movements, no questions. She would figure out what he wanted soon enough. Derek finished inputting the launch codes and leaned back slightly, stretching one arm over the back of his chair. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Then, without preamble, he asked, "You ever flown before?" The question caught her off guard. Her throat tightened. "No." Derek hummed an acknowledgement, neither surprised nor particularly interested. "Figured." A few more button presses, a final confirmation beep, and the Iron Raven lifted off. The station's artificial gravity bled away as they ascended, and Ryla instinctively braced herself, fingers gripping the nearest solid surface. Derek noticed. For the first time since they boarded, he actually looked at her. "Relax," he said. "She won't throw you around unless I let her." She doubted that. Still, she forced herself to loosen her grip even though every instinct told her to stay tense, to be ready to run if she had to. The viewport shifted from the rusted interior of the docking bay to the vast sprawl of space. The Andrelian trade hub shrank behind them, its neon lights and drifting hulls fading into the endless black. Ryla exhaled slowly. She had never thought she would leave that place alive. Derek adjusted a few more settings before standing. "Come on." She didn't move. His brows furrowed slightly, then he gestured toward the corridor behind him. "Mess hall's this way. You still hungry?" The question again, as if that was the only thing that mattered. She nodded stiffly, not trusting herself to speak. Derek didn't wait for her to follow. He just started walking. Ryla forced her feet forward, keeping her distance as they moved through the ship. The corridors were narrow, built more for efficiency than comfort. She could see signs of wear, the occasional patched panel, a flickering light that hadn't been fixed, but nothing about it felt neglected. This was a working ship. A lived-in ship. The mess hall was small, just a metal table bolted to the floor with a few chairs scattered around it. Derek moved toward a storage compartment, pulling out a ration pack and tossing it onto the table. "Not exactly gourmet, but it won't kill you," he said. Ryla stared at the package. It was standard emergency rations, the kind used on long-haul freighters or military outposts. Nutritionally balanced, barely edible. Still, she took it. Her hands were steady as she peeled back the seal, but only because she had spent years training herself not to let them shake. The first bite was bland but warm, and it hit her empty stomach like a punch. Derek leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her. Not closely, but enough to make her aware of it. "So," he said after a moment, "what's your plan?" Ryla paused mid-bite. Wait. The idea was almost laughable. People like her didn't have plans. They survived. They endured. That was it. She swallowed hard. "I don't know." Derek didn't react. He just nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Yeah," he said. "Figured that too." Silence again. She hated it. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the ration pack. She needed to know, needed to understand. "Why did you buy me?" she asked, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Derek held her stare for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose, like he had been waiting for that question. "Didn't like the other bidders," he said simply. That wasn't an answer. Not really. Ryla clenched her jaw. "That's not a reason." Derek smirked faintly. It was enough of one. Something about that response set her on edge. It was too casual, too dismissive. No one spent 1,000 credits on someone for that reason. She swallowed back the frustration rising in her throat. If he was playing a game, she didn't understand the rules yet. "Are you a slaver?" she asked bluntly. Derek blinked. Then he let out a short, sharp laugh. "No, mercenary. Then, what do you want?" Derek tilted his head slightly, as if considering his own answer. "Haven't decided yet." That scared her more than anything else, because it meant her fate was still unwritten. He pushed away from the counter. "Get some rest," he said. "We've got a long flight ahead." Then he left. Ryla sat there for a long time, the weight of those words settling over her like a second skin. She had no chains around her wrists, no collar around her throat. But she wasn't free. Not yet. And the worst part? She wasn't sure if she wanted to be. Ryla lay on the thin mattress of the sleeping berth, staring at the ceiling. The steady hum of the iron raven filled the small space, vibrating through the metal walls like a heartbeat. It was the only sound in the room, but her mind was anything but quiet. She had spent her entire life adapting to sleep anywhere, in any conditions. Cold cargo holds, damp storage compartments, even the hard floors of back-alley shelters where every shadow held a threat. Sleep had never been a luxury. It had been a necessity. A stolen thing, taken in short, restless moments whenever she could afford it. But here, in this unfamiliar berth on Derek's ship, she couldn't find rest. Her body was exhausted, her muscles sore from tension she had carried all day. Her thoughts raced, looping over the same questions with no answers. Why had Derek bought her? What did he really want? She had asked him outright, and he had given nothing but vague responses, shrugs, short phrases, half-answers that told her nothing. But no one spent 1,000 credits just to play the hero. There was always a price. Ryla sighed, shifting onto her side. The blanket he had given her was rough but warm. She wasn't cold. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't chained. And yet the feeling of captivity hadn't left her. After what felt like hours, she gave up on sleep. Moving carefully, she pushed the blanket aside and slipped out of the berth, her bare feet making no noise against the cool floor. The Iron Raven was eerily quiet at night. Or maybe it was just that she wasn't used to this kind of silence. The places she had been before had always been filled with sound. Distant voices, the hum of overcrowded ventilation systems, the ever-present presence of other people. Even in the worst places, she had never been truly alone. But here, it felt like the ship was waiting. She stepped lightly through the dim corridor, her fingers trailing against the metal walls as she moved. Every few steps she hesitated, listening. She expected to hear something. Derek moving in another room? The distant sound of engines adjusting course? Something. But the ship remained silent. She passed the weapons locker, its reinforced doors sealed with a biometric lock. A storage bay, stacked with neatly arranged crates. A maintenance panel with exposed wiring, the faint scent of burnt metal clinging to the air. Everything about the ship was functional, no wasted space, no unnecessary luxuries. She reached the mess hall, drawn there more by habit than hunger. The metal table and chairs sat empty, untouched since their last meal. Her unfinished ration pack was still where she had left it, but she ignored it. Instead, she moved toward the viewport and froze. The stars stretched out before her, endless and uncaring. She had seen them before, through rusted grates, through grimy reinforced windows in the lower levels of space stations. But never like this, never so open. It felt like standing on the edge of something infinite, something she had never been meant to touch. The weight of it pressed against her ribs, unfamiliar and overwhelming. "You're up late?" Ryla spun, her pulse spiking. Derek stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. The dim lighting cast shadows across his face, but his expression was unreadable, as always. He had changed out of his usual armor, now dressed in a loose, dark shirt and cargo pants. Even without the gear, there was something about him that felt armed. She swallowed, forcing her heartbeat to steady. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. Derek nodded, like he had expected that. He stepped inside, moving toward the small kitchenette, grabbing a metal mug from the shelf. A second later, the scent of strong calf filled the room. "You drink?" he asked, his voice casual. Ryla hesitated. This was a test. Or maybe a trap. She had been given kindness before. It had always come with a price. But Derek wasn't watching her like he expected something. He just poured a second cup and set it on the table before taking a seat. He didn't push it toward her. He didn't tell her to sit. Just left it there. Ryla stood frozen for a moment, waiting for the catch. When none came, she stepped forward, slowly wrapping her hands around the warm metal cup. She took a small sip, It was bitter, sharp, but real. They sat in silence. Derek leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking toward the viewport. "We'll be docking at Bastion Outpost in a few days." Her fingers tightened around the cup. "Why?" "Got a job lined up," he said simply. "Supply run. Nothing exciting." That was a lie. She could hear it in his voice. "And me?" she asked. Derek exhaled through his nose, watching her over the rim of his cup. "That depends." Her stomach twisted. "On what?" His gaze didn't waver. "On what you want." Her breath hitched. She had never been asked that before. She lowered her gaze to the table. "I don't have anywhere to go." Derek didn't react. He just took another sip of his Kaz as if he had expected that answer. "Then stay." Ryla's head snapped up. "What?" "You need a place to be," he said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "I need a second pair of hands." "Not much to it." Her chest tightened. This had to be a trick. No one gave something for nothing. "You don't even know if I can do anything," she said, forcing the words out. Derek smirked faintly. "You'll learn." Her fingers curled around the mug, tension coiling in her limbs. She had been given kindness before. It had never lasted. Derek must have seen the conflict on her face, because he sighed, setting his cup down with a quiet clink. "Look, I don't do charity. You stay, you work, you pull your weight. No debts, no strings. Just a job." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had spent so long being a possession, a number on a data pad, a body to be used and discarded. And now this man, this mercenary, was offering her a job? As if she was a person. Her throat felt tight. She wanted to believe him, but belief had never done her any favors. Still, she glanced around the ship. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had ever had. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. "Okay," she said softly. Derek nodded once, as if that settled things. Then he stood, stretched, and headed for the cockpit. Ryla sat there long after he was gone, staring at the empty space he had left behind. The weight of his words settled over her. No debts, no strings. Just a job. She didn't know if she believed that, but she wanted to. Ryla had never stayed in one place for long. She was used to being temporary, a shadow moving between crowded spaceports, a forgotten figure in the back alleys of lawless stations. She never lingered, never left traces, never gave anyone a reason to remember her, because being remembered meant being found. Now, on the Iron Raven, she had nowhere to run. The ship was large enough to move around without feeling caged, but small enough that every step felt like it echoed. Every corridor, every compartment was a reminder that she was here, not drifting between places like she always had. The thought unsettled her. Derek hadn't given her much to do. He hadn't told her where to sleep. She had simply claimed the berth from the night before. He hadn't assigned her tasks, hadn't asked anything of her beyond existing on his ship. That, more than anything, made her uneasy. She wasn't used to waiting for the catch. She sat in the mess hall, fingers wrapped around a warm metal mug. The calf inside had long since gone cold, but she held on to it anyway, letting the sensation ground her. She stared at the dull metal table, listening to the steady hum of the ship. Silence. It wasn't empty. She had lived in places where silence meant danger, where the absence of sound meant someone was lurking, waiting for a moment of weakness. But the Iron Raven's silence was different. It was steady, unrushed. Like the ship itself didn't expect anything from her. She didn't trust it. The quiet was broken by the sound of something heavy dropping onto the counter. She flinched before she could stop herself. Derek stood at the entrance, a metal crate in one hand, a fresh cup of calf in the other. He didn't acknowledge her reaction, if he had even noticed it at all. "You're up early," he said, setting the crate down and grabbing a ration pack from the storage compartment. Ryla exhaled slowly. You say that like you weren't already awake. Derek smirked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Fair point. She watched as he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, sipping his drink like he didn't have a single concern in the world. He was impossible to read. Calm, controlled, always just there. She hated not knowing what people wanted from her. Ryla set her mug down carefully. What do you actually do? Derek raised an eyebrow. I thought you figured that out already. Mercenary, she guessed. Sometimes smuggler? On occasion. Her jaw clenched. That's not an answer. Derek exhaled, setting his mug down. I take jobs. Some legal, some not. Cargo runs, security contracts, the occasional retrieval job. Retrieval, she echoed. You mean bounty hunting? Derek shrugged. If the price is right. Something in her stomach turned cold. She should have known. People like him, people who lived on the edges of civilization, didn't have clean records. But the idea of him being a bounty hunter didn't fit. He hadn't treated her like prey. You planning to sell me? She asked. Derek went still. For a brief moment there was no smirk, no teasing remark, just silence. Then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. If I wanted to sell you, I wouldn't have wasted 1,000 credits just to keep those bastards from getting you. His voice was calm, steady, but there was an edge to it, something beneath the surface. Ryla met his gaze, searching for cracks in the answer. Then why did you? Derek didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his hands on the table between them. You ever see what happens to people who get sold cheap? He asked. Ryla stiffened. She didn't need to. She knew. She had seen the ones who never got high bids, the ones discarded, tossed to the worst kinds of buyers, the ones who didn't survive long enough to be resold. Her fingers curled into her palms. Derek's expression didn't change, but something in his voice made her believe he knew too. You're not the first person I pulled out of a place like that, he said, and you won't be the last. Ryla swallowed hard. It still didn't make sense. No one did something for nothing. No one spent credits on a lost cause unless they expected something in return. And yet, Derek hadn't asked for anything. She didn't know if that made him more dangerous or less. The silence stretched between them. Then Derek straightened, shaking off whatever thought had held him still. Come on, he said, gesturing toward the corridor. If you're staying, you should at least know how to do something useful. Ryla frowned. I am useful. Prove it. The challenge in his voice sent something sharp through her. She pushed back from the table, standing. Fine. Derek smirked, amused. Follow me. The training bay wasn't large. Reinforced flooring, weapons racks lining the walls, a few sparring droids powered down in the corner. The air smelled of sweat, metal, and old ozone from previous training sessions. Derek walked to a panel on the wall and gestured toward the weapons selection. Pick something. Ryla hesitated. She had handled weapons before, knives mostly. She had needed them to survive, but she had never been trained. She had never been taught. She scanned the selection. A plasma pistol, too imprecise. A shock baton, too slow. Her eyes landed on a small, compact blade. Light. Balanced. She picked it up, testing the weight in her hand. Derek nodded approvingly. Good choice. Before she could react, he moved. Fast. A quick shift forward, a flick of his wrist. Her knife was gone before she even realized what had happened. She blinked. The blade clattered to the floor at her feet. Derek smirked. Lesson 1. Holding a knife isn't the same as knowing how to use it. Ryla clenched her jaw. Try that again. Derek chuckled, kicking the knife back toward her. All right, let's see what you've got. She picked it up. This time, she was ready. Ryla had learned to fight in the only way that mattered, desperately. She had never been taught proper techniques, never trained under an experienced mentor. She had fought because she had needed to, because losing meant something worse than pain. Her weapons had always been whatever she could grab, a broken pipe, a rusted blade, her own fists when there was nothing else. She had never fought to win. She had fought to escape, and that was the problem. The moment she lunged at Derek, he sidestepped easily, his movements controlled and effortless. Before she could even process what had happened, his hand closed around her wrist, twisting just enough to make her drop the blade. Again, the weapon clattered to the floor and she clenched her jaw, yanking her arm free. She was breathing heavily, but he wasn't even winded. "That's the second time you've done that," she muttered. Derek smirked. "Maybe don't make it so easy." Raella glared at him, bending to retrieve the knife. The weight of it felt different now, less like a weapon, more like a lesson she hadn't learned yet. The training bay was small but functional, the reinforced flooring built to absorb impacts. The air smelled faintly of metal and sweat, the walls lined with weapon racks and sparring droids that hadn't been activated. The lighting was dim, casting soft shadows over the space, making it feel like they were standing in the calm before a storm. Derek stood a few paces away, his posture relaxed, arms hanging loosely at his sides. He wasn't even armed. That made it worse. "You want to keep trying, or do you want to actually learn?" he asked. Raella rolled her shoulders, adjusting her grip on the blade. "I am learning." Derek tilted his head. "No, you're reacting." His eyes flicked over her stance, analyzing every shift in her weight, every movement she made. "You fight like someone who expects to lose." The words hit harder than she expected. She had never thought about it before, never questioned how she fought. She had survived this long. That had been enough. Hadn't it? She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to adjust her stance. "All right," she muttered. "Show me." Derek gave a slight nod. "Try again." She did. This time, she didn't just throw herself at him. She watched him, his balance, the way his weight shifted just before he moved. When he dodged, she adjusted, twisting her body mid-strike, aiming for his ribs instead of where he had been. It still wasn't enough. Derek caught her wrist again, but this time there was a brief moment where she almost slipped past him. It wasn't victory, but it was closer than before. A flicker of something passed over his face, approval maybe, but it was gone before she could be sure. "Better," he admitted. She flexed her fingers, shaking out the tension in her wrist. "You're holding back." Derek smirked. "You want me to break your arm? That's not very practical." She narrowed her eyes. "I want you to stop treating me like I'm fragile." His expression shifted. The amusement faded slightly, replaced by something else, something unreadable. Then, without warning, he moved. Fast. Before she could react, he swept her legs out from under her. She hit the floor hard, the impact rattling through her bones. Her breath left her in a sharp gasp. Derek crouched beside her, resting his forearm on his knee. "You're not fragile," he said, his voice calm. "But you're untrained, and right now, you fight like someone who's waiting to be beaten." Raella pushed herself up, ignoring the ache in her limbs. "You want to learn?" Derek continued. "Then stop thinking about surviving. Stop thinking about running. You fight like you plan to win." She held his gaze. Something cold and stubborn settled in her chest. "Fine," she said. Derek grinned. "Then get up." She did. And this time, when they fought, she wasn't just surviving. She was learning. By the time Derek finally called it quits, Raella was drenched in sweat, her muscles aching in ways she hadn't felt in years. She had bruises forming on her arms, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The knife in her hand felt different now, familiar, like it belonged there. Derek, infuriatingly, wasn't even winded. "Not bad," he said, stretching his arms behind his head. "Few more rounds and you might actually land a hit." She shot him a glare but didn't waste energy arguing. She knew a compliment when she heard one. He tossed her a water canister and she caught it, drinking greedily. "Tomorrow," Derek said, "we'll work on getting you to stop telegraphing your movements. Right now, I can see every attack coming before you make it." Ryla lowered the canister. "You want me to be a fighter?" "I want you to not die," Derek corrected. "You're on my crew now. That means knowing how to handle yourself." Crew. The word settled strangely in her chest. She wasn't sure she believed it yet. Derek didn't push, he just nodded toward the exit. "Get some food, you'll need it." She hesitated, then nodded. As she turned to leave, Derek spoke again. "Ryla." She stopped, glancing back. Derek's expression was unreadable. "You can win," he said. The words caught her off guard. They shouldn't have mattered. But somehow they did. The Iron Raven sliced through the dark void of space, its engines a steady hum beneath Ryla's feet. The ship had become familiar in a way she hadn't expected. Its narrow corridors, its dim lighting, the scent of metal and ozone that clung to the air. It was no longer just Derek's ship. It was her home. And right now that home was under attack. A sudden jolt rocked the ship, throwing her off balance. She slammed into the bulkhead, catching herself with one hand before she hit the ground. The warning lights flickered red, casting long, shifting shadows along the walls. Derek's voice cut through the chaos over the intercom. "Ryla, get to the cockpit now." She didn't waste time questioning him. Her feet pounded against the metal flooring as she ran, dodging loose equipment that had been thrown from the shelves. The Iron Raven wasn't built for luxury, but it was built to last. Except right now, it felt like the whole ship was groaning under the weight of something far worse than turbulence. When she burst into the cockpit, Derek was already at the controls, his jaw set, eyes scanning the displays with practiced efficiency. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded. "Parrots," he said, voice tight. "They must have picked up our trail when we left Bastion Outpost. They're trying to force us to dock." Ryla's stomach twisted. She knew what that meant. Pirates didn't just take cargo, they took everything, ships, supplies, and people. "How do we stop them?" she asked. Derek didn't answer immediately. His fingers moved across the console, adjusting the ship's trajectory, rerouting power. The Iron Raven shuddered under another impact, and the external sensors flared with proximity warnings. "Shields are holding for now," he said, "but they're running interference. They're not trying to destroy us. They want us alive." Ryla swallowed hard. That wasn't comforting. Derek turned to her. "Weapons bay, second locker on the left. There's a rifle inside. Bring it here." She hesitated for half a second before bolting down the corridor. She had been in the weapons bay before, but this was different. The hum of the ship's systems was now accompanied by the distant thud of energy blasts against the hull. It felt like the whole ship was waiting, holding its breath. She yanked open the locker and grabbed the rifle. It was heavier than she expected, its grip cool against her palms. When she returned to the cockpit, Derek was already adjusting their position. He took the rifle from her without a word, checking the charge before tossing it onto the co-pilot's seat. "Strap in," he ordered. She barely had time to obey before the ship dropped. Her stomach lurched as the Iron Raven dove hard to the left, engines flaring as Derek pushed the thrusters to full. The stars outside blurred as they veered into a sharp roll, narrowly avoiding another blast from the pursuing ship. Derek's knuckles were white against the controls. "If we can't outrun them, we're going to have to outsmart them." Ryla's breath came fast. "How?" A smirk ghosted across his lips. "Ever seen a dead ship before?" She blinked. "What?" Before she could finish the thought, Derek cut the engines. The sudden silence was deafening. The hum of the thrusters vanished, the artificial gravity flickering for half a second before stabilizing. The ship lurched, but then nothing. They were drifting. Dead in space? Ryla's heart pounded. "Derek!" "Quiet," he muttered. His eyes were locked onto the sensors, his breath slow and controlled. "Let's see if they take the bait." The pirate vessel slowed, its weapons powering down just slightly as it approached. They were scanning, waiting. Ryla's fingers curled into her seat. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something, but she forced herself to stay still, to trust him. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then the pirate ship moved in closer. Derry's hand hovered over the controls, waiting, calculating. The moment they were within range, he slammed the throttle forward. The Iron Raven roared back to life, engines blazing as they surged toward the enemy's ship at an impossible angle. "Hold on," Derek shouted. Ryla barely had time to brace before he fired. The ship's forward cannons unleashed a barrage of energy, catching the pirates off guard. Their shields flickered violently under the assault, alarms flashing across their hull. They had expected easy prey. They hadn't expected Derek. The enemy vessels swerved hard, trying to adjust, but Derek was already ahead of them. He twisted the Iron Raven into a tight spin, bringing them behind the pirate ship before they could retaliate. A second blast rocked their hull, and then silence. The enemy ship powered down, its systems fried, engines flickering uselessly. Derek let out a slow breath. That's more like it." Ryla sat frozen, her pulse racing. "Did we just—" She swallowed. "Did you just outfly pirates?" Derek smirked. "Would have been embarrassing if I didn't." She exhaled sharply, half in disbelief, half in something dangerously close to admiration. Derek flicked a switch, setting their course back toward open space. The danger was over. "For now." He glanced at her. "You all right?" Ryla hesitated, then nodded. Derek studied her for a moment before leaning back in his seat. "You did good." Her chest tightened. "I didn't do anything." "You didn't panic," he corrected. "That counts." She frowned, but didn't argue. Silence settled between them, different from before, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but understood. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about escaping. She wasn't thinking about what Derek wanted from her. She was thinking about what came next. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to find out. The Iron Raven drifted through the quiet vastness of space, the hum of the engine steady beneath Ryla's feet. The tension of the pirate attack had faded, but it still clung to her like static in the air, unseen but impossible to ignore. She had fought alongside Derek. She had trusted him. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't running. That thought unsettled her more than it should have. She found herself in the mess hall, fingers absently tracing the rim of a metal cup. The calf inside had long gone cold, but she hadn't moved to get another. The weight of exhaustion pressed against her bones, but her mind refused to quiet. She had survived. But survival wasn't the same as winning. The sound of boots against metal broke her thoughts. Derek entered the room, rolling the stiffness from his shoulders as he crossed to the counter. He didn't say anything at first, just grabbed a ration pack and leaned against the counter as he tore it open. "You good?" he asked eventually, not looking up. Ryla hesitated. That was the question, wasn't it? She had been through worse. She had lived through worse. A pirate attack was nothing compared to the things she had seen, the things she had survived. But it had been different this time. She had had something to lose. "I'm fine," she said. Derek snorted. "Sure you are." She frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" He tossed a piece of dried protein into his mouth, chewing thoughtfully. "Means I saw your hands shaking when you strapped in back there. Saw the way you clenched your jaw, like you were waiting for the worst." Ryla's fingers curled around her cup. "Habit." Derek studied her for a long moment. Then he pushed away from the counter, moving toward her with an ease that was almost lazy, except it wasn't. Derek never just moved. Everything he did was deliberate, controlled. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, resting his arms on the table. "You ever been in a fight like that before?" he asked. She exhaled through her nose. "Not in a ship, not with someone else at the controls." Derek nodded, as if that answer didn't surprise him. He leaned forward slightly. You ever wonder what happens when you don't expect the worst? She blinked. What? You fight like someone who's already lost, Derek said simply, like you're bracing for the hit before it comes. A muscle tightened in her jaw. That's what surviving is. Derek tilted his head slightly. Maybe. But you're not just surviving anymore, Ryala. Something about the way he said her name sent a strange warmth through her chest. She looked away. That doesn't change anything, doesn't it? She hated that he asked questions like that. Hated that he made her think about things she had spent years ignoring. She set her cup down, suddenly restless. Derek caught her wrist. It wasn't a harsh grip, not even tight, just solid. Her breath caught. You don't have to run, he said quietly. Ryla swallowed hard. She didn't move. Derek didn't either. The warmth of his skin against hers sent a ripple of something unfamiliar through her, something she didn't have a name for. She had been touched before, but not like this, not without expectation. He wasn't holding her back. He was holding her here. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Derek released her wrist, his fingers lingering for just a second longer than necessary before he leaned back in his chair. Get some rest, he said, his voice quieter than before. You earned it. Ryla nodded, but she didn't move right away. She could still feel the ghost of his touch against her skin. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she wanted to pull away. The Iron Raven floated in the quiet vastness of space, the battle behind them, but something else lingering in the air between them, unspoken, unresolved. Viola sat in the co-pilot's seat, staring out into the darkness, the soft glow of the console casting faint light across her face. She wasn't used to stillness. Not the kind that wasn't waiting for the next disaster, the next fight, the next desperate escape. But here, in this moment, the ship was silent, steady. She was here, and she wasn't alone. Derek was beside her, his hands resting loosely on the controls, though the autopilot was engaged. He wasn't looking at her, but she could feel the weight of his awareness, the way he always seemed to know exactly where she was, what she was thinking, before she said a word. They had fought together, survived together, and now there was nothing left to do but feel. She exhaled slowly. You never told me where we're going next. Derek's lips twitched slightly, but his gaze stayed on the stars. Does it matter? Ryla hesitated. It should have, it used to. She had spent her whole life needing an exit plan, needing to know where she would land before she ever let her feet touch the ground. But now, she shook her head. No, I guess it doesn't. Derek finally looked at her then, studying her with that same quiet intensity he always did. But there was something different in his expression, something softer, something sure. You really staying then? He asked. She turned to him, holding his gaze. Do you want me to? His jaw shifted slightly, but his eyes didn't waver. I wouldn't have asked if I didn't. Her chest tightened. She had spent so long being unwanted, being something to be bought and discarded. But Derek had never treated her like that. Not once. He had given her a choice, and now she was making one. She reached for his hand before she could second-guess herself, her fingers brushing against his. A hesitation, a breath. Then he turned his palm, catching her hand in his own, his grip firm, steady, warm. Ryla felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with something new, something she hadn't let herself have before. Derek's thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles, his touch careful, testing. When she didn't pull away, when she only held on tighter, he exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding something back. All right, he murmured. That one word carried weight. A promise. He leaned in first, just enough to give her space to change her mind, but she didn't. She met him halfway, her breath catching as their lips brushed, tentative at first, then deeper, as if sealing something unspoken between them. Not an obligation. Not a bargain. A choice. When they finally pulled apart, Derek rested his forehead against hers for just a moment, his breath warm against her skin. "Where to next?" she whispered. His smirk was slow, lazy, hers. "Anywhere," he said, "as long as you're with me." And for the first time in her life, Ryla didn't need an escape plan. She had already found where she belonged.